So welcome, John Payne, the Director of Science for Conservation International. It's a pleasure and honor to have you on board for the Ocean in Motion classroom sessions. And thanks very much for making the time. It's great to have someone with such a vast knowledge and background on the science and data behind a lot of ocean conservation and what you do for Sea Shepherd and the work that you guys do globally, which is hugely impactful and inspiring. So maybe just start off by introducing yourself a little bit more. I can ramble on, but I'd rather you give us a very succinct and accurate indication of exactly who you are, what you do, and why it's important at Sea Shepherd.
Thank you. Yeah. So I am the Director of Science for Sea Shepherd. I just started this job last fall, and I'm an ecologist. My parents studied whales, and so I grew up spending a lot of time in remote places, mostly on the seashore, and just have a tremendous love for wild places. I've worked all over the world. I've worked a lot in developing countries. I was in Mongolia for a couple of years. I've worked in Africa. I've worked in Latin America. And my specialty, I suppose, is population dynamics, and also have done a lot of tracking animals with satellite collars. Worked in fisheries for a while. And at Sea Shepherd, essentially, we're trying to build a science program and to make Sea Shepherd into a organization with a really respectable science background and credentials to improve our ability to speak with some authority on issues around the ocean. And we've got the Sea Shepherd has had some campaigns in the past that are focused mostly on science. But we're expanding that. We're trying to increase the number of campaigns that are done and on the number of ships and places. And we're also making our ships available to outside scientists. So we're trying to support various different kinds of research that people are doing that are conservation oriented, that fit with our overall mission of protecting the oceans.
Which is quite a lofty task, as we know.
Well, we're trying to do our little part, yeah.
Yeah, and it seems that Sea Shepherd has been doing an amazing job, obviously, in the protection of conservation of all mammals and species, especially ocean-based, from illegal fishing and that kind of thing. But I think a lot of people also don't realize the amount of science and the amount of research that goes into the back end of that to be able to drive change, drive impact, and create policy change and that kind of thing, which I think is, as we know, is incredibly difficult because you're collaborating often with very different policy leaders and across borders and boundaries of countries that is very challenging to accommodate, mediate, and make changes on, because it transcends borders and boundaries, because it's mostly ocean based. Is that always been quite a significant challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. And Sea Shepherd has tried, I would say they've tried different approaches, and in their early days they were very confrontational. They were down in the Antarctic getting between whaling ships and whales. And thank goodness they did, because whaling eventually stopped in the Antarctic. But that kind of approach also tends to build up resistance. And at the moment, Sea Shepherd is currently trying a somewhat different approach, which is to work with governments to stop illegal fishing. And what we do, the model is basically to take Coast Guard or Navy crew on board Sea Shepherd vessels, and then help to patrol places where countries don't have the resources to have their own ships out there patrolling. And when a vessel is spotted that's fishing illegally, for example, in a protected area or something, or with gear that's inappropriate, then we run the Coast Guard out to the fishing vessel in a little fast rubber boat, They board the fishing vessel and they do inspections and they make arrests or levy fines or force the boat to come back to port, whatever. But there are huge, there's several huge fleets of fishing vessels that are mostly doing illegal fishing in the oceans. China has an enormous fleet, but so do South Korea, Spain, Taiwan, and others.
And John, I think, as you mentioned, I think that's the one thing that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, and because it's in the ocean, people don't see it. You see things happening that are illegal on land a lot easier because it's in front of you. You can monitor and you can manage it. But when we're talking about the ocean, it's so vast, and a lot of this is happening, either in the middle of the ocean or it's happening hundreds or thousands of miles offshore. So that's always been, as you mentioned when we were having the conversation yesterday, it's always been one of the greatest challenges is how do you police that? And Sea Shepherd's always done an amazing job, especially in the early years, by getting, in between, and it has become, you guys had a reputation for being very confrontational, but it was making incredible impact and no one else was doing anything about it. So the way that it was done might not have been the best way at the time, but it was creating impact. It was creating awareness of what was happening out there and that no one was policing it and the extent of the devastation that it was doing to the fish stocks globally. And you obviously, as an ecologist and specializing in the fisheries side, really attest to that, and I'm sure could see it very prevalently. And I think a lot of people don't get and understand when we're talking about like fleets of big fishing vessels coming in from Japan and from Korea and what have you. I mean, they're traveling thousands of miles from their destination because they have the ability to be able to do so. And these are massive fishing vessels that have the ability to be able to long line and do all the kinds of fishing that are one, illegal, two, in being done in places which are marine protected areas often, or on the borders of those, and are catching huge amounts of fish with the wrong and illegal types of fishing methods. Do you want to maybe elaborate on that a little bit more? Because I think a lot of people really just aren't aware to the extent and the kind of vessels and the extent of these kind of catches and what kind of devastating impact they can have.
Yeah, that's right. There's been some sort of increased attention to it in the last few years. For example, there's a very good book by a journalist named Ian Urbina called Outlaw Ocean. Illegal fishing often goes hand in hand with other kinds of illegal behavior. So when you look at the tracks, so all large vessels in the ocean are supposed to have transponders on them called it's called an AIS system. That
I have one of those myself. Yes.
Okay, good.
And I'm not allowed to turn mine off either.
Yeah. Well, these big fishing vessels are not supposed to turn them off, but it turns out that you can, and you can cheat and you can mess with the data in various ways. But most of the time they leave them on. And if you look at the tracks of these deep sea fishing fleets, they are at sea sometimes for more than a year at a time. They're being supplied by tankers that meet them out in the ocean, open ocean, and refuel them. And that fuel, it's known, is subsidized by the Chinese government and others, so that they can just stay out essentially indefinitely. And they concentrate where there are big the fishing vessels concentrate where there are big concentrations of fish that are just outside national boundaries, essentially. So, for example, there's a huge fleet.
International waters, is that what you're talking about? Because a lot of people actually don't even know that there are distinctions between international fishing grounds and non-fishing zones.
That's right. Yeah, and most of the fish and there are also habitats in the ocean. You think of the ocean as being all one big thing, but most of the life in the ocean is actually near the edge of the continents on the continental shelves, which are the relatively shallow, only a couple hundred feet deep, a few hundred feet deep. And then at the edge of the shelf, it drops off and goes down to the ocean bottom, which can be 10,000 feet or more. But in some places most of the central ocean is essentially has very little life, relatively speaking, in it, the high seas. Also, in terms of jurisdictions, the areas around the continental margins are all out to 200 miles is considered the exclusive economic zone of the country, of the coastal countries. And when you get out beyond that, now you're into the high seas, and there is essentially no effective management of fishing in the high seas. There are some mechanisms where people are trying to impose some management on that, but it's been a very big problem that ships do what they want. And these big fleets of illegal fishing ships also cheat. They'll sit right outside the edge of the exclusive economic zone, for example, off the Galapagos, and then they turn their AIS off and come into the Galapagos and grab fish. And then
John, what kind of vessels are we talking about? So people can get an idea, like in regarding to the size and the capacity of what they can bring in, and how they transfer. How do they transfer it?
They're absolutely massive. We're talking, 100 meters long, 300 feet long. They can catch vast quantities. In many cases, they're after squid, but they also catch tuna. As you mentioned, they will use illegal fishing techniques such as floating drift nets, which catch everything. They catch dolphins, they catch sharks, they catch seabirds, sea turtles, whales. They long line. This is putting out very, very long lines with thousands of hooks on them.
And that also catches pretty much everything as well. And that's absolutely devastating to all sea creatures that get caught inside them. And they can't really, once they're caught, they can't escape. So they just become part of the bycatch. That's correct.
Yeah, long lines have, they're usually targeting tuna, but they catch a lot of other species. They're particularly, so fishing gear it has different levels of being selective. Some of it's quite selective and you really get what you want. If you're fishing a dense school of something with a purse seine, you're not going to get a whole lot of other kinds of bycatch. But long lines are notorious for getting a lot of bycatch, and gill nets are even less selective.
And that's happening still to this day all the time. And it's really not being policed besides by, the Sea Shepherd team, really. I mean, how extensive is the policing of this in those zones? Because as we know, we've got some incredibly fragile ecosystems around the Galapagos and other areas like that are meant to be highly protected, because some of those biodiversities are so fragile and so unique in the world that they can't be replaced, and they cannot be replenished once they get devastated.
Yeah. Well, I should say that, so first of all, Sea Shepherd itself is against fishing in general. When you're on our ships, they're all vegan all the time. And I actually love that. I think that's one of the things that's great about it. But it's also fair to say that commercial fisheries that are legal are much better regulated than illegal fisheries. So on legal fishing vessels, for example, there are in some fisheries, there's quite a high proportion of observers, and those are people who are on board simply to watch and make an honest report of exactly what's caught, including all the bycatch. The proportion of observers is not high. The so-called observer coverage is not high enough.
I see you smiling when you say that, because that seems to be quite a challenge. And now, obviously, with films like Seaspiracy coming out and that kind of thing, it shows that it's not the most effective solution, and that also can be manipulated to some degree as well, which is pretty tragic when you see it, because you realize, one, how difficult it is, two, how vast the areas are that you're trying to cover and enforce, and three, like, that it's really difficult to manage and control.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, industrial fisheries have such huge capacity. They're able to there's so many ships out there that can catch so much that it is very hard to control them. adequately. And I would say so far they have not been controlled adequately in many cases. But it's also true that illegal fishing is even worse problem because there you have zero control. So, if you can steer more illegal fisheries towards legal fishing, at least you're making a little bit of an impact.
Yeah. And when you talk about the kind of catches that these kind of vessels can get up on board to these vessels without having to go back to port, what kind of loads are you talking about? Like what kind of capacity would they be able to harness?
Oh, it's thousands and thousands of tons, but I don't know that. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it's thousands of tons for sure. Yeah.
And where do you see the greatest challenge in regarding to what type of fishing that's affecting what specific fish that have become threatened? What are you seeing as the greatest challenge to the chain in regarding to the different types of fish, and which ones are really under pressure and under threat the most due to these issues that we're talking about?
Yeah, probably right now worldwide, the biggest impact or the biggest problem at the moment, one of the biggest problems is sharks. Sharks were barely caught at all for a long time. They were just considered sort of bycatch, like, oh, we caught a few sharks by mistake when we were trying to get something else. But recently, the Chinese market has been paying very high prices for shark fins to make shark fin soup. And apparently this is really a cultural change. It wasn't a big deal, 20, 30 years ago, and it is now. And so there are now targeted fisheries on sharks. And the problem is that sharks are relatively slow. They mature at a late age. They grow slowly. They live a long time. And so when you take adults in a population like that, you have a very big impact on the ability of the population to come back, to recover. And there are now targeted fisheries on sharks all over the world. And unfortunately, they're very, very effective. And shark populations have dropped immensely.
And I think a lot of people don't realize like how important, they've been given a bad rap for a very long time due to unfortunate films that have made people terrified of them. But I think they're starting to get better press and a better rap just through ocean conservation and through awareness and through people, diving and free diving with sharks now, knowing and understanding how they move, how they react, and then they're not like mindless killing creatures. They actually are the most beautiful, majestic apex predators, and they are such an important part of the biodiversity, but even more so from the chain in regarding to how they fit into the structure of the ocean. They are one of the most, if not the most important predators out there that keep the balance within the ocean and the ocean health. And I think a lot of people aren't really aware of their magnitude of how much they affect everything and keep the balance. And without them, or with a degradation in those shark balance, it really does devastate the whole rest of the ocean chain.
Yeah. I mean, you put that well. I guess I would say that the ocean is less static than we think it is, and you tend to think it's some
less
sort
resilient.
But we tend to think of it as being as there being some ultimate state that is stable, and it's not really like that. It shifts all the time. I mean, for example, that's the scary thing about climate, is that we kind of assume that if we leave climate alone, it'll stabilize and be in a zone that we like. But there's nothing really to prevent the Earth from getting much too warm, for example. That's what we're worried about at the moment. So,
and I think that's a really nice segue to go into the two sort of next topics, which one would obviously go into what we mentioned yesterday, which was very fascinating, which is talking about the ocean acidity, and then the other one would be ocean noise. And I think a lot of people aren't aware of the fact that the ocean has a certain pH level that is safe for fish and for crustaceans and for all life to flourish and thrive. But if the pH levels go too far out of balance, then everything basically battles to just survive. And I know that's a sort of you've done a lot of science and a lot of research on that. Can you give some, everyone just a really basic understanding of how the ocean toxicity, as in the pH levels, affects everything, and what the concerns are that you've seen in the data and science that's showing that it's getting more toxic, basically?
Yeah. So the ocean has the ocean has been, so what's causing climate change right now is that we're burning fossil fuels, and when we do that, we're releasing a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and it's a tiny fraction of the atmosphere, but it's still billions and billions of tons. And carbon dioxide does a number of things. One is that it traps greenhouse. It traps. Usually, when a sun ray comes from the sun and it hits the surface of the Earth, some proportion of the rays get absorbed by the surface of the Earth, and then some bounce back out into space. And carbon dioxide just happens to be a molecule that is very good at catching those rays on their way back out, on their way in or out. And so it is warming the atmosphere. But the other thing it does is that when you think of this huge, the atmosphere is sitting right on top of the ocean, the ocean and the atmosphere are interacting all the time. And the ocean has actually absorbed 93% of the heat of the additional heat that we're creating. It's also absorbed 30% of the carbon dioxide. And the unfortunate fact is that when you add carbon dioxide to seawater, there's a chemical reaction that ends up making the seawater more acidic. And in the ocean, all the ocean food chains are supported by tiny little microscopic plants, and then they're called phytoplankton, and then there are tiny microscopic or very small animals, marine animals that eat the tiny marine plants, and we call those zooplankton, and then the little fish
goes up the chain,
and so on, bigger fish. So it all comes down to the very bottom of the little organisms really matter. And it turns out that many of them make shells in the ocean out of calcium carbonate, and their ability to make shells is compromised as the ocean becomes more acidic. And so, and we don't know exactly how this is going to play out. It's an area of very active research right now. But for example, commercial growers of oysters and clams, and the commercial shellfish companies are already seeing a big impact of acidification. For example, along the West Coast, they're very worried about it. They're saying, whoa, this is really scary. And you think of the organism going from being tiny to growing and growing and getting bigger. And it may be that, some stages of that growth are particularly vulnerable to acidification. So people who work on fisheries and the oceans are actually afraid that, even though most people have never even heard of this problem, that it could be in the future the biggest threat to the oceans and to fisheries in general. So it's very scary, but it's sort of newly understood, and we're still doing a lot of research on it.
Well, as you said, and I think it's a really important thing to bring to light, is that, again, it's the awareness factor, because people aren't aware of it, because the ocean's so vast, they don't see what's happening, and it doesn't translate directly into what we're seeing day to day. So it's hidden. Like these giant challenges and problems that we need to find dramatic solutions to very quickly are not prevalent. So they're only coming to light now. And I think people forget how that everything is connected, right from the smallest creature. And everybody thinks, oh, well, the smallest creatures, they don't really matter because they sort themselves out and they flourish, But when you start doing the research and you start, going into the science behind these kind of challenges, then you realize that the smallest creatures, everything has a knock-on effect right up the entire food chain. And like we're seeing microplastics in the food chain that we eating today, like every single little thing has a massive impact, and it starts at the smallest creature, but it all ends up into going to the apex predator and then going onto our plates and everything else. But it's not only that, it's also affecting climate. It's also affecting the ocean, how the pH level is affected, which then affects everything. And every second breath we have comes from the ocean. So right. and it also affects the climate change, and then it's sea level rise, and everything is all connected. And I think most people are just unaware of the massive impacts of that on everything, because it's all connected and each one stacks on another and compounds the problem.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So where's the solutions in all these? Let's talk solutions and what you think we can do in that space, from a research perspective and from a solution-driven thinking perspective of like, where do the answers and the solutions come for what we're seeing and experiencing now, John?
Well, first of all, even though I think it's very common for all of us to feel sort of helpless because we're only one little person in this
Yes.
in this huge world. But if you put together, if you took everything that you bought in a year and you put it out on the lawn or something, you would be shocked at the volume of even just the food alone. And so our choices really do matter for things like our consumption choices, what we eat, eating less meat or no meat is good. Being careful of what fish you choose, or not eating fish at all, is good. Our choices like what car we drive. Are we driving some huge gas guzzling thing, or are we, can you afford to have an electric car? They're much better. So our consumption choices really matter. I think another thing that people perhaps underestimate is their own political power. And I feel very strongly that, especially when I talk to young people, I feel that we're living in their world. They're inheriting this, and they can do things differently. The world is not, it's not set in stone that the world is the way it is. It happens to be the way it is right now. But for example, for businesses to be more responsible is absolutely critical. And I've been very impressed by businesses like Patagonia. You look at them, they've really gone deep into their supply chain to try to understand where they're creating waste, where they're creating problems, where they're creating exploitation. And, why is Patagonia the only business I've seen who's really done a good job on that? I know there are others, but, I think all businesses should be thinking more like that. And then in terms of the open ocean and the problems that we're involved in with regulating fisheries and so on, for citizens to support better regulation is extremely important. In the European Union, the Sea Shepherd has recently, they're introducing, this is Sea Shepherd Global, a different branch of Sea Shepherd, but they're introducing a resolution to make it illegal to sell or trade shark fins in the European Union. And because the European Union happens to be one of the biggest traders in the world for shark fins. And that's a citizens initiative. And if that kind of thing can be pushed through, it will have a huge impact. So I think I think essentially to educate yourself, to be conscious of your choices, to speak out about things that matter, both on social media and in real political forums, is just super important. And I've been, for me, maybe the most exciting thing about Sea Shepherd, since I'm still relatively new to this job, is just meeting the volunteers, and a lot of whom are young, and just seeing, there's just this fantastic group of committed, excited people who want to live in a better world, and they're willing to make it happen, to do what it takes.
Yeah, I think that's really positive, and I think that's a great area to finish up that topic on, because it's a mindset and attitude, and you do see it in the youth. Like they really are a lot more um, future driven and seem to have great positive foresight in regarding to what needs to change, when it needs to change, and they more focused on let's make the change now because it needs to be done. Like, why can our current leaders not see what is happening, what needs to happen, and why it isn't happening immediately, and we need to take action in order to do that? And that was never something that happened in the past generations, but you see it in the youth generations with people like Greta Thunberg and the whole small, like a whole group that is transformed into a global, very impactful society in the youth that are really pushing for change and making the current leaders stand up and take action. And they can't be silenced. They can't be, pushed down. And I think it's a really inspiring time in a lot of ways to be able to see that, little people with big ideas can make enormous impact. And when you collaborate together for the same common goal and vision, you can really change the world. And I think that the youth of now have really showed us that. And I'm really excited, if I'm positive about anything about how to take climate action, is really seeing the new youth take ownership and take leadership roles over the next 5 years. That's really going to drive a lot more positive change. And it's really great to see through education in schools and what have you, them really pushing that and being, I think the key to change a lot of the time is having the awareness and the knowledge so you can make better decisions. And I think that's really key. And make people understanding that if they make small actions each and every day in some small way, that can have massive downstream impact. And when you do that on a massive scale, that's what creates change.
Yeah, one thing I would add too is that there's been there's an attitude that's very, very common around the world, which is that all government is hopeless and all government is bad and so on. But government is actually a very important part of the solution. And to me, when when I see people protesting, like for example, the Occupy Wall Street protest, it happened, it was a big deal. It got a lot of attention, and then it sort of fizzled. It didn't go anywhere. And I think the problem was there weren't people who were willing. So they managed to get a seat at the table, but they didn't know what to do with it. And so that's one of the things I say to young people is like, we need people who know what to do when they get a seat at the table, because making these changes is not simple. Making changes in institutions is what lasts. And it's very, very important. And the point of all the protest is not just to protest, it's not just to make yourself feel good. It's to get a seat at the table and then actually make a change. And so, I really encourage people to learn what it takes to do that and to become those, the kind of people who can do that.
Yeah, I think you're 100% spot on. And I think, social media has a great way of, you have these marches, or you have these things where it creates a lot of attention, a lot of impact and drama in that moment, but then that fades. And the key to success in regarding to changing policy, like, and see with Sea Shepherd, because you're dealing with authorities and you're dealing with trying to get policy change, is that you need to create that, but then you need to leverage off that and then follow it through all the way down the line. And that's a arduous, long, consistent process that takes huge amounts of effort consistently for a long period of time through the right channels. And I think that's where you guys have also worked really hard at creating that. You have the links, the relationships with the right people and organizations and authorities in order to be able to take that to the next level. And I think that's really key to the success of driving really positive change too.
Yeah, and the conservation community, especially in the United States, has really learned that lesson, and they're very sophisticated now. A lot of these groups are, they have very strong ties in Washington, and they've got strong ties with their local legislatures, and so they get stuff done that's just amazes me. They're not. We're sort of even though the advertising looks the same, you save the baby pandas kind of thing. what they're actually doing on the ground is much more sophisticated, and it's been fascinating and very encouraging to me to see that, like this huge conservation bill that got passed when the Republicans controlled all the branches of government. And it's like, wow, that took hundreds and hundreds of people working together. So
that's exciting. John, but let's touch on that last subject, which I'm quite excited about, because we have a guru and a legend in his own right in that space. When we start talking about sedation levels, which as a lot of people know, some people don't know, which is noise pollution, and the recording of noise pollution across different areas of the ocean. A lot of people don't realize the magnitude of the amount of noise that is in the ocean across different ways, shapes, or forms, but also the amount of marine traffic and how that's affected the amount of noise. And people, may ask themselves, well, how does that make any difference? That doesn't affect anything. Well, a lot of people also don't know that a lot of the marine creatures out there, especially large mammals like whales and what have you, they communicate via their whale calls or whale songs. And we're going to get into that and why that's important shortly. But a lot of people don't realize that they communicate over hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles using their communication methods, which are dramatically affected by the amount of marine traffic, marine noise that's created from that. And as I know, tell us a little bit about it from your side, because I know that your father, or was it your grandfather, that started recording humpbacks and realized that they actually sing, and now there's a whole industry around those beautiful humpback whale songs, which I've heard a lot of, and I've heard them singing when I've been training for the big wave surfing side, and I find it fascinating, and it's the most beautiful, powerful, connecting sounds I think I've ever heard.
Yeah, they're amazing. I was thinking you can sometimes hear humpbacks singing through the hull of a boat. If it's a quiet boat, like a sailboat, people have heard them singing from, lying in their bunks. And I was thinking you may even hear them on your way across, which would be amazing.
I'm only separated by literally less than an inch. So I think that'll be very highly likely that will. But I remember when I was training for the big wave surfing world tour and what have you, I used to train at Waimea Bay, which is on Oahu, which is one of those beautiful bays. And I used to spend a lot of time doing underwater training. And I remember a lot of the time over that time of the year, which is when the humpbacks are doing the migration, and they're also doing breeding in that area, how I would often listen to them when I was training underwater, because I'd spend a lot of time, and I got to listen to these humpbacks singing and communicating between. And I spent so much time training underwater there that I could identify like the different whales that were singing by their songs. And for me, that was one of the most special parts of surfing big waves for me, was the training in Hawaii that I used to do when I used to listen to the whales while I was training underwater. It was the most incredible sensation. So tell me a little bit more about it, because I know that you've been very involved with that. Obviously your father's been very involved with that, and where does that take us, and directly and translate into data and research, and what you're discovering now?
My parents discovered that whales were singing. If you've ever seen the record, the song of the humpback whale, that was their recordings from Bermuda. There had other people had recorded whales earlier, and there was particularly a Navy guy who had made a lot of recordings. He was supposed to be listening for submarines, and he was interested in these strange sounds he heard, but nobody really understood what they were. And my mom did a lot of the work on the songs and realized that, they're structured like a bird song. But the strange thing is, if you go out and listen to a robin singing here, it's going to be the same as a robin singing in the East Coast, and it'll be the same as it next year as it was last year. But whales are doing something different, which is that in any one location, like in Hawaii, let's say, all the whales are singing basically the same song with some variations. But if you come back next year, that song will have evolved. So there's some sort of cultural mechanism that's changing the song over time. And in different places, they're singing different songs. But we think the songs are probably have to do with males advertising to females. But whales in general and whales and dolphins use sound because you can't see very far in the ocean, and if you get down deep, there's no light at all. So sounds for marine mammals are basically their eyes. It's their way of seeing what's around them. And my dad discovered a long time ago. He wrote a very influential paper with a guy named Scott McVeigh that showed that that some of the species that make the loudest sounds, such as fin whales. Okay, wait, sorry, I have to digress.
It's such a fascinating topic, and I think a lot of people aren't aware of it. So it's really cool. And when you are answering this question, also talk about how far they can communicate, because I think people aren't aware of that either.
Yeah, so that was my digression. So sound happens at all sorts of different frequencies, from very low frequencies to very high frequencies. And the high frequencies don't travel very far. That's true in the air and in the water as well. The low frequencies travel a long way. And in the ocean, they also get reflected by changes by the bottom, and by changes in the salinity and temperature of the water. It actually sort of makes a mirror. So the waves bounce up and down like this, and they'll travel very long distances. And it turns out that at really low frequencies, there's a lot of noise from earthquakes and stuff like that. And at higher frequencies, there's lots of noise from, surf and wind and snapping shrimp. But there was a window that used to be very quiet, and it was right around 20 hertz, which is down at the very lower limit of human hearing. Like, we can just barely hear 20 hertz sound, but if it gets lower than that, we can't. And it turned out that frequency band was quiet before ships came along. And unfortunately, ship propellers make most of the sound that a ship makes, and they unfortunately fill that band in with lots and lots of noise. But my dad and Scott McVeigh showed that two fin whales could have heard each other across any ocean basin, so thousands and thousands of miles.
Wow.
Because
that's incredible. I mean, that is incredible. Yeah. Like, most people have no idea. And I think if anybody also hasn't watched that beautiful documentary called, I think it's called 52, the story of the lonely whale, which you've got to watch it. It's incredible, okay. John. It's such a beautiful movie. It's the story of 52, which was a whale that was communicating at 52 hertz, and they picked it up because they thought it was a submarine or whatever, and they tracked it, and then it kept on coming up, and people didn't realize that it was one whale that was communicating at a hertz level, at a sedation level that was different to all other whales. As you said, a lot of the whales go down at a really low base, and 52 is very unusual. And they actually thought, they found out that maybe it was just one really random whale that communicated at a hertz range that no other whales, and that's why they called him the loneliest whale, because they thought that he was an anomaly, and he had been roaming and swimming the oceans by himself, calling, and no one was answering for decades. And it's a beautiful story. So I think it's the story of the loneliest whale of 52.
Yeah, so, I'll have to watch that.
Right down your alley.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about that, and how the marine traffic, which obviously increases in certain areas, like the area that I went through in the Monterey Bay area, and when I leave the coastline from California, I'm going across these marine traffic zones, which are obviously super high sedation levels because of the marine traffic and the amount of noise pollution from the propellers, and how that affects the whales and the dolphins to communicate, especially because that also goes across some of their zones where they're traveling up north to be able to migrate.
Yeah. Yeah, well, unfortunately, sound travels a long way underwater, and especially the lower frequencies. And so, for example, cruise ships going up into the fjords in Alaska, where humpbacks are feeding, that's shown to have a big negative impact on the feeding, because they're cooperatively feeding. They're catching fish. They let bubbles out as they're swimming in a sort of spiral going up, and and then they all come up in the middle
Incredible.
of the bubbles because the bubbles they scare the fish and to
Yes.
stay in this pack. But it turns out that cruise ships sound is interferes with that cooperative hunting behavior and so on. Another really big problem with ships that's relatively more recent is just ships hitting whales, because unfortunately when a ship's coming straight at you and you're sitting close to the surface, you don't hear them very much. Most of the sound, they're relatively quieter if they're coming straight at you. And so we're seeing, people who study whales are seeing lots and lots of ships that have been hit and horribly injured by propellers of ships, everything from little pleasure boats running very fast around these, around areas that have cetaceans, to great big container ships that, there was one that came into port in Los Angeles with a whale draped over the sort of bulb.
Yes. Oh, horrendous.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it does seem like that, whales also stay quite often quite close to the surface, especially when they're in their migration route. So when you've got whales on a migration route, which sort of crosses paths with the marine traffic zones, that obviously creates huge challenges. And I think even more so over the last 10 years. I mean, you must have some data and science that shows the impact of how much the marine traffic has increased over the last decade, and therefore that compounds the amount of noise pollution and sedation levels dramatically, in the ability of, obviously, one, the whales to be able to communicate, but they also navigate through sound as well, which obviously then impacts on that as well.
Yeah, and there are efforts to do things like zoning, essentially marine zoning, so that you say, look, we've tracked whales and we can say that this area here is very important to them. So we try to route ships around that. There are even efforts to put active acoustic arrays down near some ports that can hear when whales are in the area and making sounds, and then they tell ships to slow down. So, people are trying. I think there are solutions to these problems. As I said, they're much less likely to get hit out in the middle of the open ocean than they are when they're messing around on the coast near a big port or something. So,
I guess that was what I was going to ask: is what solutions are in place at the moment, and what is really being done that you find maybe exciting in regard to the future of the data that's been found. Obviously, we know the impact that it's making now, and what is sort of getting done and implemented long term that might help that and minimize the impact on the mammals and the migrations.
Well, I got an interesting call from a guy who was a engineer for a company in Europe that runs 60 ferries that go back and forth across the North Sea and so on. And he said, we want to make our ships quieter. And, is there any way to do this? And I said, I don't know. I haven't looked. And so I did a little research myself, and I discovered, yes, there's been one of the really big shipping lines, I think it was Maersk, did make an effort to make their ships quieter. They looked at how they could change the propeller design and how they could change the isolation of the engine from the hull and so on, and they made a significant impact. So I think it's possible. It's always possible to do better. You think about submarines.
Yes.
Submarines are designed to be silent. So
yes. And I think that there's a lot of work being done on electrifying things, so making it electric instead, which will make a significant difference to the sedation levels. And also on a smaller scale, even hydrofoils have been generated to be starting to get used on a lot of the ferries now as well, which elevates them out of the water, and also is driven a lot by electric too. So I think there are quite exciting developments. I don't think that that from on a commercial standpoint, it's not ready now. They're just starting to get implemented, and it might take another 5-10 years, but at least the solutions are out there and they are being implemented, even though they're not as quick and as we'd like to see, but the future is coming, and it is more green, it is more quiet, and hopefully that'll make a big impact in a positive way on what we're talking about, which will affect the whales and the dolphins, the migrations, and just general the lowering of the sedation levels, which is amazing.
Yeah, I think that actually electrification doesn't have a huge impact on the sound produced, because it's even though the engines sound loud to us, it's the propellers that are making the noise. But slowing down the ships has a very big impact, and that was one of the big things that Maersk did, was that they just slowed their ships down, and they also, in the process, it turned out they saved lots of fuel. So for them, it was not a bad thing. Yeah.
When it affects the bottom line, all commercial business start taking notice, don't they?
That's right. Yeah.
John, to wrap up, thanks very much for your time. I know that we've gone a little bit over what we thought, but it's very interesting and insightful information, and I really appreciate your time on that. So if you could give like sort of 3 tips to people out there in regarding to how can we be better as humans each and every day in some small way to make less of a negative impact and be better for the oceans and our planet, what can you leave us with your inspiring words of wisdom today?
Well, that's a hard one. I don't know exactly how to answer, but be aware of your own impact, because you have a big impact. Try to be optimistic about the future. Don't accept that the world is the way it is, because you can change it, you and your friends. And educate yourself. Trust people who are experts on things, or at least pay attention to those opinions, because they matter, and spread the good word. Yeah.
And get involved and take action. Like get involved in some of the work that Sea Shepherd does. I'm sure you guys have got a big volunteer program, as you said, like on the website, and all the links that I'll share about Sea Shepherd and all the amazing work that you guys do. There are multiple different links in regarding to how people can get involved. How can you support what they do? Because they really do and are driving a lot of amazing positive change. So thank you very much, John Payne, for all you do and all the work that Sea Shepherd does globally. Thanks very much for coming on and sharing your insights.
Thank you, Chris. And I also want to say I'll be following you. I think it's absolutely amazing what you're doing, and congratulations. And I hope you have a smooth and safe journey.
Thank you very much. I'll see if I can. I'm going to try and see if I can do some recording of some of the whale songs across the journey. So I'm really excited to be able to hopefully share that with you, if I can get that all together and play it back to you. Now at least I know someone that can decipher the whale songs better than I. So I'm looking forward to that. Thanks very much. John Payne, thank you very much. A privilege and an honor. Thanks very much for your time, and have an amazing rest of your day, and keep up the great work.
Thank you. You too. Bye.